Illness and Cure, Chapter 14. Variable Individual Tolerance. Subjective Attitude of the Therapist. Because so much of therapy of everyday nervous complaints is interwoven with the prescription of different drugs, a study of some of the pitfalls in their use is not out of place. Strict psychotherapy and psychoanalysis should not be carried out without any chemical magic, but I know several therapists who make favorable use of drugs at the peak of difficulties with mentally disturbed patients, especially in older persons. The combination of medication and psychotherapy can be of considerable help. The automatic prescribing reflex makes us accustomed to looking on the human organism as a machine which always reacts in some way. Often, however, especially in psychotherapy, a drug acts favorably when the patient wants it to, or leads to an opposite result when he unconsciously wants to make trouble. I have observed alcoholic patients in such a state of anger and resistance that they gradually competed with anti-abuse, and they have taken and drunk alcoholic beverages in spite of the symptoms they provoked. The unconscious aim was to prove that the therapist's influence on them was bodily and that they were stronger than every medical magic or restrictions. The intricate relationship between medication and therapists who describe it is largely unexplored. The doctor-patient relationship plays a tremendous role in the final results. During World War II, there were many examples of how approved methods worked well for one physician and badly for another. A case in point is the application of necroanalysis. Some doctors failed to elicit unconscious materials no matter what amount of barbiturates, sodium amytal, they injected, while other therapists discovered that without barbiturates and with slight suggestions, the soldier cooperated in everything, even in the analytic theory of necroanalysis. The provider of medicaments often plays just as important role in the drug's action as the chemical action of the drug itself. Especially when new drugs are introduced in therapy, the physician must recognize his own emotional investment in their success, the confidence and enthusiasm he transfers unobtrusively to the patient. In the doctor's attitude, we find the reason that so many forms of therapy gradually lose their impact. When the new drug becomes routine, the patient no longer gets any love out of it. It is possible to give some clinical rules concerning paradoxical and intolerant reaction to alcohol and other sedative drugs. From practical purposes, I mention alcohol, barbiturates, amphetamines, and antarctics in one breath because they are all used to influence the central nervous system and they are prescribed in most confusing combination. Reaction of variable tolerance are of great social importance because of the accidents that follow in their wake and the unexpected criminal behavior they may result. Many highway accidents are related not to alcohol abuse but to paradoxical reaction of antihistamines and antarctics. With all drugs, human susceptibility to intoxication can vary within wide limits. Even the same person may react differently to the same drug at different times. Although we know a few facts about the psychological background of this varying behavior, there is little literature on the subject. Wilder's rule that the initial situation and the initial value rules effect of the drugs must be upheld here. Wilder's rule and the initial situation and the initial value rules, the effect of the drugs must be applied here. Coincidental action of different drugs. In the age of aspirin, the increasing addiction, the magic act of sorrowing has become such a habit that medical control of different pharmacological actions which fortify or counterfeit each other is rather difficult. We see this especially in the alcoholic who only take barbiturates or antihistamines or antarctics. One of my patients, an extremely intelligent physician, became even more antaxic than before and caused a car accident as a result of this bad pharmacological judgment. In the clinical study of the action of narcotic drugs, we often observe the phenomena of variable tolerance. A patient who previously had normal tolerance for sedation overreacts. This happens frequently in chronic users of barbiturates. Such a drug addict may unexpectedly show signs of sedation after taking his usual dose for so-called mental stimulation. In toximaniacs, the addicts, we repeatedly observe this in constant reaction to drugs. The idiocratic reaction may look like a suicide attempt and is often labeled as such because the chronic addict, for unknown reason, falls into a deep coma without having increased his usual dosage. Let us consider the chronic alcoholic. He has usually reached a rather high tolerance not only for alcohol but also for pharmacological related narcotics such as ether and chloroform. As a result, it is rather difficult to induce general anesthesia. His intoxicated and changed cerebrum cannot be put out of action easily. However, when after a long phase of initial excitation, he finally is put into a deep narcosis, his vital limits are reached sooner. There is a greater danger and the vital centers of the midbrain will be affected. Cessation of breathing or sudden heart death may result. We can see, when we use this example as a prototype for our further clinical expose, for in case of variable tolerance for drugs, there nearly always exists an incidental cooperation of more than one noxious stimulus. We can even deduce a rather instructive automatic picture of these complicated actions. Acute alcohol poisoning exerts its principal narcotic action on the cerebral cortex, while chronic alcoholism gradually displaces its center of action towards the midbrain. The final phase of heavy year-round alcohol intoxication may be so-called alcoholic encephalitis or the weekend. The final phase of heavy year-round alcohol intoxication may be the so-called alcoholic encephalitis of the weekly, in which microscopic hemorrhages appear in the midbrain. If other narcotics or sedatives are being added, exerting their action in the same vital brain centers, additional damage ensues. For simplification, I will omit the manifold problems related to changes in the metabolism of alcohol as a result of pathological changes in intestinal functions, such as the hepatic cirrhosis. Several secondary symptoms of alcoholism could be additionally explained as due to lack of absorption of certain food components, vitamins, caused by damaged metabolism. The increased and uncontrolled use of the public of all kinds of sedatives, addicts, drugs, alcoholic products, and antihistamines, all acting on the central nervous system, add to the importance of the problem of incidental coaction and change tolerance. The strangest complications have been noticed following abuse of those drugs, and the most paradoxical actions. In the last years, we have become acquainted with the dangers of certain food, such as cheese combined with specific psychic energizers and tranquilizers. Instead of sleep and sedation, high blood pressure, excitement, and maniac exhalation may ensue, as we often see in the reaction of chronic alcoholics to barbiturates. Persons addicted to morphine generally do not like alcohol, but if they ingest alcohol, they too react in rather intolerant way. Cocaine and marijuana addicts are more used to taking various kinds of drug at the same time, and they exhibit all kinds of increased psychopathic actions. True drugs, often used in therapy, especially change the tolerance for alcohol. They are barbiturates and atropine. Formerly, atropine was given in increasing doses to patients with post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. We are forced to forbid the use of alcohol in this case because acute alcoholic intoxication could result in either an acute alcohol intolerance or an atropine intolerance. The various barbiturates are used in more uncontrolled way by patients who try to give themselves more and more in a piece with larger and larger doses. And therefore, we more often see the cumulative action in the midbrain damage in these cases. Case 1. A soldier wrote a note to his comrades saying that he had committed suicide. His friends ran to his billet and found that he already was half awake again after he had slept following a large dose of Vernol. As a therapy, they gave him a stiff drink of whiskey. As a cumulative result, He went into a deep coma again and reacted with epilepsy convulsions. He was brought to the hospital and regained consciousness soon after treatment with calamine. A man who had consumed large amounts of barbiturates over a long period suddenly showed a clinical picture of progressive paralysis, with paralysis of the pulmonary action, reaction, convulsion, dementia, speech disturbance, and such. All this developed after an alcoholic binge. When he recovered, he stated that prior to becoming addicted, he had been able to drink as much as he wanted. Case 3. While out of his last call for the day, a physician who was treating himself with antihistamine because of a cold was invited to have a glass of beer to peep with him. He immediately became drunk and antaxic and had to be brought home. Under normal circumstances, a glass of beer does not affect him in the least. The most curious examples of addiction and accumulation of acute and chronic intoxication may be observed in chronic alcoholics. Dysphomaniacs, for instance, show different degrees of tolerance to alcohol. When not in their dysphomanic state, they have a normal tolerance and become drunk rather quickly. In the pathological phase of dysphomania, however, they walk around in a sort of dreamy state and can absorb enormous quantities of liquor without becoming really drunk and ataxic. In such a state, barbiturates will not induce sleep but often will make the patient more excited. This change in tolerance is explained in the result of temporary change in function of the vegetative centers of the midbrain. For example, in their abnormal phase, many chronic alcoholics have an increased need for sleep and general polydyspepsia, diabetes insipidus. They are extremely depressed. This syndrome is often interpreted as belonging to the maniac depressive psychosis, intolerance in cerebral disease. It is easily understandable that cerebral disease will influence the tolerance for alcohol and drugs. It is especially known that one of the subjective symptoms that persist the longest after cerebral concussion is intolerance for alcohol. This sometimes leads to very confusing legal situations. Case 4. An engineer was called into court for driving his car while drunk. He was involved in an accident and his car was wounded slightly. A policeman noticed that he was in a state of ataxia and mental confusion and also smelled alcohol. A test for alcohol in his body was not made. The man denied drinking more than one small glass of gin, and his wife and friends also denied vehemently that he was under the influence of alcohol. During medical examination 2 weeks later after the accident, I found, in addition to various subjective signs, an increased optokinetic after nystagmus, a somatic symptom of cerebral concussions. That is why I could inform the court that this man most probably had had symptoms of sudden cumulative reaction with intolerance for the circulating alcohol. The coincidental circumstances of trauma and alcohol had caused the syndrome. Other examples of coincidental action are the postencephalitic reaction or reaction to drugs in the presence of other cerebral diseases such as meningitis or poliomyelitis. Here we may often expect the more paradoxical reaction and growing exhalation instead of sedation and narcosis. The cerebral patient can develop an abnormally high tolerance for some drugs, atropine. However, barbiturates cause a real form of neuropathic idiocracy. In such case, alcoholic drinks often stimulate criminal reactions, especially in cases of postencephalitis. In cases of cerebral tumor, we may find either acquired intolerance or even a higher tolerance for drugs. Case 5. Bonhoeffer cited the case of patient with hypophysiopolydicea and acromegalia who had had a normal tolerance for alcohol before his illness. During his slowly progressive disease, he began to drink. He even took part in the drinking match, where he drank everyone else under the table. thanks to his hypophyseal tumor, which increased his tolerance for alcohol. Case 6. A sailor was sent to the hospital because he was chronically drunk and because of the progressive mental dullness. His relatives had not seen him for some time and did not know the details of the case. Nevertheless, they mentioned 2 symptoms which had impressed them. 1. The patient always had been very tolerant to alcohol, but now he could not drink without becoming intoxicated immediately. From time to time, he became blind without being aware of the fact. 2 days after hospitalization, the patient died suddenly, with symptoms of acute meningeal irritation. Only a few neurological symptoms had been noted and the diagnosis had not yet been established. The autopsy confirmed the tentative diagnosis of cerebral tumor. A huge soft frontal glioma was discovered which had caused atrophy in both hemispheres. Case 7. A non-alcoholic came to the hospital with a fractured skull following an accident. Case 7. A non-alcoholic came to the hospital with a fractured skull following an accident. He had hemorrhage of the spinal cord and hemiplegia. During his convalescence, he could not drink even a small glass of wine without immediately feeling dizzy and intoxicated. It took him more than 2 years to regain his former tolerance. Some persons who undergo brain operation remain intolerant to alcohol and other drugs for some time. In case of short-lasting psychosis caused by infection, we also find the most intolerant and paradoxical reaction to drugs. Influence of oxygen lack. It is a general observation that alcohol is poorly tolerated in a room without enough oxygen. People in such rooms often interrupt their drinking to take a walk in the fresh air. Alcohol forms a compound with hemoglobin in the blood. That is why alcoholics appear cyanosed so quickly. Oxygen helps to burn the alcohol almost immediately, and that is why the alcohol levels in the blood decrease rather soon. The highest alcohol levels in the blood are reached 45 minutes after intake. In 1 or 2 hours, the level is normal again. Increased oxygen inhalation speeds this process. Carbonation speeds the passage of alcohol through the stomach and increases the alcohol in the blood, which explains why champagne causes intoxication more quickly than other beverages. At high altitudes with lower oxygen tension, sensitivity to alcohol may increase because the oxygen pressure is not great enough to break down the alcohol hemoglobin compound. Persons who live at higher altitude learn to adjust to lower oxygen tensions, but in general, we find heavier forms of intoxication at higher altitudes. Alcohol is dangerous in mountaineering. This means that it may be unusually dangerous for airplane pilots and passengers to drink at high altitudes. Even in pressurized cabins, one is never completely sure regarding the changed tolerance for alcohol. Case 8. During a plane trip, a passenger became acutely drunk and sick half an hour after drinking 2 whiskeys. The cabin was depressurized too high an altitude and many passengers were dizzy. The combination with alcohol, however, was the cause of the illness in this man, who had hardly ever become drunk before. Some of the antihistamines, although used for air sickness, can have a depressing, intoxicating influence on passengers. I may also mention growing alcohol intolerance in diseases where there is general oxygen lack in the tissues, such as emphysema in cardiac and pulmonary diseases. In tropical and damp atmospheres, the easy burning of alcohol slows the circulations, whereas the phasal reflexes should be better adjusted to increase circulation and cool the organism. This may cause uneasy feeling of congestions and make persons in humid tropical climates more quickly intolerant to alcohol drinks. The increased tolerance in cold, bright weather may explain the higher incidences of chronic alcoholism in certain regions. The damp tropics act as a negative selective factor, as it were, the moment a person grows addicted to alcohol. A nearly forgotten clinical fact is that pure oxygen is one of the best antidotes in acute alcohol intoxication. Van Wolfenparte in Holland taught us to apply oxygen subconsciously. taught us to apply oxygen subcutaneously in cases of acute delirium tremens. In children with dangerous acute alcoholic ingestions, oxygen may be life-saving. I found several reports in the medical literature of small children who had drunk a bottle of liquor and arrived at the hospital in coma. They died, even after therapy with many stimulants. Yet the use of additional oxygen therapy was not mentioned. Influences of food intake. Food can have the same influences on alcohol action as oxygen does, although milder. Solid materials slow down the rate of which alcohol gets into the blood. During meals, there is a lower alcohol curve. Fruits, however, can increase the curve. We all know that a hungry man is more intolerant to alcohol than a man who drinks at dinner. Yet, it is still a subject of investigation on how the composition of food and the arrangement of the menu may influence tolerance for and enjoyment of drinks. Muscular activity, too, lowers the alcohol level of the blood. Alcohol allergy. Are we allowed to speak of the real alcohol allergy in the same way we speak of some protein allergies? Indeed, we should first have to prove that there exists an initial sensitizing dose and that the following reaction to alcohol should be quantitatively and qualitatively different from the initial one. However, in medical literature, the word allergy is often used in much wider sense. Even when we do not know how some drugs act as sensitizers and what kind of allergies are produced, the clinical fact of allergy reactions, meaning a sudden deviation in tolerance, is accepted. Some students of allergic reactions think that the drugs changes the proteins of the body and the resulting reaction develops as a new reaction towards this deformed protein. Clinically, it is known that an intolerant reaction to several narcotic drugs may develop only in combination with certain foods, meats, and fish. What do clinical facts tell us about allergy to alcohol and other drugs? Some patients react to relatively small quantities of alcohol with collapse. There is tremor, vomiting, dizziness, nystagmus, ataxia, and excessive hiccuping. Such patients have a pale faces with a typical mask of roughly spread vasodilations, but there is no change in consciousness or troubling of the mind. Days afterward, they cannot bear the smell of alcohol. Once they have experienced such unexpected reactions, for a long time, they may become dizzy soon after drinking relatively small quantities of alcohol or even when they smell it. We can compare their reaction to that which some persons have after other narcosis. For years, they cannot stand the smell of either. When do we see such reactions? We see them sometimes in chronic alcoholism. Suddenly, the alcoholic becomes intolerant and cannot look at liquor. The reaction may be related to the hypnosis which disturbs the alcohol oxidase, so that one day an insufficient combination takes place. We may observe the same qualitative altered reactions to alcohol and drugs after infectious disease or after severe exhaustion, starvation, and much more. We may see it too after the drinking of potent mixtures such as certain cocktails. Perhaps the mixture of alcohol with some protein sensitizes the organisms. Why the different mixtures and combinations have such different effects on soma and psyche is still a problem. The same is true for the different actions of various concentrations of alcohol in liquor, wine, beer, and for additional products that give the specific bouquet. Case 9. A chronic alcoholic was forced into obsession because of imprisonment and starvation during the war. He celebrated his liberation by drinking half a bottle of whiskey. He became so sick with a typical allergic reaction that he could not bear or smell whiskey for months thereafter. This changed his original drinking habit completely. Case 10. I attended the following patient who died suddenly after an allegedly allergic reaction. He was a sergeant who suffered depression and anxiety and was dismissed from the hospital after electroshock treatment. He had a party for his friends, and after drinking 2 small glasses of whiskey, he became ataxic and did not feel well. He nevertheless drank 2 more glasses. Altogether, not more than 100 cc's of whiskey. He gradually lost consciousness and motor conversions developed. He died 3 hours later in a deep coma. I saw him 2 hours after the intake of alcohol, and he was already in a deep coma, making choreatic and athetotic movements. The stomach was emptied and various stimulants were given. There was no other neurological findings. At that time, we were not aware of the useful action of oxygen. Autopsy was not performed. His friends told me that he had been used to drinking many whiskeys, but he had not drunk at all during the period he spent in the front and in the hospital. We have to think of a possibility of undiagnosed brain tumor, but we often see now the electroshock treatment changes the tolerance for alcohol and other drugs. In several of these cases, I also got the impression that part of the sudden intolerance could be caused by a psychological factor, namely intense fear, which altered the whole metabolic reaction. Dangers of withdrawal and obsession. Less well known than some of the other points I've discussed is the fact that sudden stopping of drugs habits or even food habits can set up temporary disorder in the organism. Case 11. One of my patients was prevented from continuing his routine of drinking and sedation when he was sent on an extended official mission. He came back sick with a typical abstention syndrome, tremor, anxiety, gastrointestinal disturbance, which was easily overcome by guided sedation. Obsession, withdrawal, starvation, deprivation, or change of other habits may cause acute stress which are important clinically, as we see in the severity and the resulting symptoms. We may speak here of the breakdown of automatic feedback, which in itself may lead to increased sensitivity to other influences. In some cases, convulsive discharge may occur. Case 12. A patient of mine who had compulsive rigid food habits made a trip to a foreign country, and his food ritual was completely disrupted. He had not only had gastrointestinal disturbances without any bug to be found, but for the first time in his life, he became accident prone and had several accidents with his car. Sudden trauma, sudden deprivation, or sudden change in circumstances may change the relationship between foreign affairs and home affairs in the body. It is important to realize that they seldom, if ever, are made aware by outer signs of the degree of the potential adaptation we possess, or for how much hidden temporary neurotic adjustment and urge for self-defeat are latent in us. Obsession, starvation, or sudden change in circumstances may provoke hidden defects and make the organism less tolerant to new drugs and medication. Drug intolerance resulting from psychological circumstances. A man's mood and attitude prior to drinking bout determine in part the toxic reaction. Yet only a few students are aware of the social implication. One can never be sure of the tolerance stability in some people. The driver behind the wheel undergoing various psychic tension is especially subject to this rule of variable reaction. World War II taught us that the number of soldiers who once had been rather tolerant of alcohol became more and less intolerant to it when in state of battle fatigue and anxiety neurosis. Many of them tried to drink as a kind of autotherapy against fear, but very soon they rejected with a state of pathological intoxication and excitement. One of the common complaints in cases of combat fatigue was that the victims became drunk so easily. This pathological reaction to alcohol remained long after the neurotic soldier returned home. In some instances, it led to tragic and criminal implications. Case 13. A soldier returned home after 3 years of internment as a prisoner of war. His anxiety state was not treated during the period, but initially he had adjusted himself rather well. On the way home, he began to drink and became very silent. He was never really drunk, but he changed from a friendly person to a silent, morose individual. After all kinds of irritation, including red tape, he arrived home and suddenly a paranoid psychosis broke. He was jealous and suspicious and threatened his wife and children, and of course, he drank still more. After a routine military medical checkup, he was sent to a hospital before too much harm was done. There, after a few days abstinence and detoxification, he became a friendly person again, fully aware of his neurotic attitude and his need for psychological treatment. During the war, he learned the hard way. That is, in periods of corrective stress and anxiety, alcohol and drugs for the most part produce a paradoxical reaction. Neither a shot of whiskey nor a shot of barbiturates could help calm the patient in corrective panic. We had to resort more and more to pure psychotherapeutic methods of action, trusting our own judgment more than the pharmaceutical magic which was available to us. The same is true for various tranquilizers and euphemistically called antidepressants. In many cases, they increase the depression and anxiety. Case 14. A leader of the underground resistance movement had been hidden between the front lines for a couple of days without food. When rescued, he was in a state of exhaustion. He tried to give him some liquor as a stimulant because he had important information about the situation behind the enemy line. However, he was in maniac state and too confused. Luminol produced even greater agitation. Morphine did not help either. Then we gave him insulin, sugar and bromides, and the next day he was no more again. Expect that he exhibited a slightly paranoid attitude. Certain personality types are very sensitive to alcohol and sedatives. Persons with strong ego defenses and compulsions who are afraid of give away part of their unconscious kept. Certain personality types are very sensitive to alcohol and sedatives. Persons with strong ego defenses and compulsion who are afraid to give away part of their unconscious kept far from any sedative. Sometimes the very thought of being drunk in itself makes them sick. Compulsive persons, in general, and those with the irritability of the sympathetic nervous system are intolerant to alcohol. Epilepsy and mental deficiency make for tolerance. Epilepsy and mental deficiency make for intolerance too. The individual with a schizoidic personality reacts sooner with angry, aggressive reaction than do others who become either gay or sad in their intoxicated state. Hereditary intolerance. In some families, there is a greater sensitivity to alcohol than we normally see. This may be a dominant hereditary factor. The same is true for drugs such as aspirin, quinine, aminopyline, and barbiturates, for which an innate endocyclaxy sometimes exists. In studying such families, one finds many other symptoms of increased sensitivity of the central nervous system. For instance, one may observe quicker psychiatric reaction to bacterial toxin and other forms of reactive psychosis. But here too, the greater sensitivity is interwoven with various forms of mental condition in different families and social groups. The problem of variable individual tolerance has far more implication than the question of incidental change reaction. There exists a constant interrelationship between constitutional factors, mental conditioning, and the action of exogenic toxins. For instance, susceptibility and resistance to the infection diseases are partly dependent on these various variable factors. Alcohol and drug give us, as it were, the experimental setting and show us the variable sensitivity of responses in man. Tolerance is influenced by the mental state during the ingestion of the drug. It depends on fatigue, on whether or not the person is in chronic use of drugs or alcohol, or another person's, and on the person's weight and condition. It also depends on his cultural and intellectual level. Primitive men react differently than do civilized men. The primitive man reacts more rapidly with fewer complications. In the same way, a juvenile reacts to cerebral intoxication. Drug effects are more immediate in primitive man than in civilized and inhibited man. A short-lived mental disintegration and psychosis. We observe, for example, that some natives run amok after drug intoxication in the same way as they do during pneumonia, malaria, or extreme exhaustion. In the more civilized, alcohol and drugs have to break through a wall of ego defenses with all the implication of their breakdown. However, the same individual may react differently to the same drug at different times. This depends mostly on the underlying psychic and the somatic status at each given time. The examples of variable tolerance which I have given here have practical significance since addiction to drugs and drinking seems to have increased. Moreover, the increasing dependency and medication makes the coincidental combination of drug action with its pathogenic implication a greater possibility. Some of these incidental actions are what make certain drivers more accident-prone after intake of medication. End of chapter 14.